It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, by George, I think he's got it. Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Well, it's showtime, and it's time for the big three. We're going to be talking about climate today. We've talked a lot about Ukraine and some other issues, President Biden's State of the Union response, and the response to the response from Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds. But, first and foremost with me, the top of the funnel is climate. And you've heard me say on the show before that, people don't seem to be listening to the scientists, and they don't seem to be listening to the politicians, certainly. And I've said, I think somebody that they might listen to is their local weather person, the guy that's on local television. They seem to know and trust these folks. They seem to like them. If you've ever seen the state fair coverage coming out of Iowa, they seem to adore them. So, I was always hopeful that they would address this issue that is, right there got us on the window edge ledge, folks. But it wasn't happening very much. And then this guy comes into Des Moines and he's on television and he's doing it, folks. And that's our friend, our buddy, our pal. We're going to bring this up on screen here and show his live line. It's Chris Gloninger. He's coming on the podcast by George live line today. And I'm just delighted to have him on. Here's his bio. KCCI meteorologist Chris Gloninger became interested in weather when Hurricane Bob hit his hometown of Sag Harbor, New York. He received his BS in meteorology from Plymouth State University and was awarded a CBM from the American Meteorological Society, where he presently serves on the broadcast board. Chris's career has taken him to Rochester, New York, Albany, New York, Saginaw, Michigan, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Boston, Massachusetts. All those are great hockey towns, by the way. And while at his sister station, WISN, Chris met his wife, Kathy, who was assistant to the station's general manager. They were married in Milwaukee. And in his travels, Chris has been able to cover all different types of weather: hurricanes, EF4 tornadoes, flooding, historic ice flows, blizzards, and nor'easters. He was sent to cover hurricanes in New York, Florida, North Carolina, and Texas. Most recently, Chris established Boston's first climate change series. And he produced 2 half-hour specials on how climate change affects all aspects of life. Now, Chris has won 3 Emmys already. He's not that old of a guy, folks. 2 NBC GEM Awards and the Wisconsin Broadcasters Association Awards. So let's get him on in here. Let's welcome our new friend, Chris Gloninger, to the podcast by George Liveline. Hi, Chris.
George, thanks for the invite. Great to be with you.
Yeah, thanks for coming in here. Okay, so let me start just by bringing this up to kind of, again, show people what we're talking about here, how significant this is, and it's in the daily news. Let me see if I can advance this slide. Okay, this is out of the New York Times, and the headline reads, "Time is running out to fix the climate," the report says. "The dangers of climate change are mounting so rapidly that they could soon overwhelm the ability of nature and humanity to adapt, creating a harrowing future in which floods, fires, and famine displace millions, species disappear, and the planet is irreversibly damaged," a major new scientific report concluded. Now, you've heard me talk about that report. That's from the UN. That's that IPCC report, which is hugely significant. This is out of the USA Today. Quote, "Parts of the planet will become uninhabitable. Life in some places on this planet rapidly reaching the point where it will be too hot for the species that live there to survive," international climate experts said in a report on Monday. Okay, so let's get back to Chris here. So, Chris, there's a little bit of a dichotomy here, because even the climate scientists will tell you that weather is not the same as climate, and climate is not the same as weather. But I kind of look at it and think that the weather is really linked to the climate. That's true, right?
When you have more extremes, there's no question that what you're experiencing is exacerbated by climate change. The extreme warmth that we had in December, a pattern like that only became warmer because of climate change. So that is one aspect of it. So yes, day to day, you look out the window, that's the weather. But climate change is the longer range effects and impacts and trends. However, as I mentioned, it goes back to the fact that it can make things worse. It can make the extremes worse when it comes to our day-to-day weather.
Let's talk some about your career tack here, because this is interesting to me, and I kind of intimated it a little bit here at the beginning. But I grew up in this market. I've grown up in this area. I can tell you that, and I'm not going to pick on any stations or meteorologists or anything like that, but they've kind of steered clear of this climate issue, and it's a sensitive one. Obviously, there's a lot of political elements to it, but not so much with you. You seem to be wanting to address this and to connect the weather and the climate. Now, is that purposeful on your part, and is that because of your background?
It is. It is purposeful, because I think this education needs to be more than just East Coast or West Coast cities. You can probably read between the lines there. And I was preaching to the choir when I was out in Boston, and I've used the analogy that it's almost like stepping into the lion's den here. Yeah. Although the feedback hasn't been perhaps as negative as I thought it would be. In fact, I think that there is a lot of positive support hearing these connections made on TV. I went on a school visit, and I won't say the school that I visited, but I asked the essentially science assembly, George, if they thought smoking caused cancer. Every single hand in that room, in that auditorium, shot up. If that same audience was asked, do humans contribute to climate change? Far fewer hands went up. The science that shows smoking causes cancer or health problems is equivalent to the science that shows climate change is anthropogenic. It's human-driven, human-caused. Yet, again, that's a perfect cross-section of looking at the problem and seeing that, yes, this has been politicized, it's been polarized, and people just aren't educated on the issue. They think and they've heard that, oh, this is politics. But the reality is, when it comes to scientific research that goes into climate change, there's enough support. There's as much support as there is, again, that smoking causes health impacts to the human body.
I started off talking about the experience that you have covering all types of weather over various parts of the country. But I know people in your profession, the meteorologists, really like this part of the country because we've got a little bit of everything. Now, we don't have hurricanes, but we've got something somewhat akin to hurricanes. And it's these damn derechos that we've been hearing about. And I never heard about those back in the day. And to me, I point to that and say that's one good example of some of the changes that are taking place. But these more severe weather outbreaks are kind of, proof positive. It's evidence here in the heartland.
The relationship, there are, if you can envision this in your head, a graph of weather phenomena and the correlation between that phenomenon and climate change. There's less data showing the impacts of climate change on severe weather. But we do know that the atmosphere back on December 15th would likely have been not present. Those elements would not have been present 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
So maybe climate change didn't cause that derecho, but it certainly helped fuel the conditions that made it a prime environment for that thing to explode and to create 61 tornadoes across the state of Iowa. There is research that looks at the ingredients. So that saying, go big or go home. We may have more of those go big moments than maybe the number of days in a year that we see severe weather. But the days we do see severe weather, it's going to be bad. And we're starting to see that. And I think we've already learned that lesson now twice. And it's more than just a warm December day with severe weather. It was the warmest December day ever recorded in the state of Iowa. And it was the first derecho, not just in the state of Iowa, but anywhere documented in the country of a derecho during the month of December.
I'm reminded just thinking about that of the movie Don't Look Up, and the scientist that's in there that sees that comet coming towards Earth and does that double take, that they've seen something. I put up a map. I was talking to Dr. William Gallis at Iowa State University that you may be acquainted with up there. Now, he's been teaching meteorology for decades, and he saw the map that you're talking about for that day in December, and it was like, oh, what is that? I mean, you're not supposed to be seeing that in the middle of December. It was the same kind of reaction to something that should not be there, yet it is. And I guess my question for you is, do you expect to see more of that, or is there any way to tell?
Again, I think those days that everything does, you get that royal flush, so to speak, if you play cards. I think that we will have more days like that, maybe not the number of days that we get just run-of-the-mill severe weather that we would normally see. So yes, there will be more of it. There's no question about that. And the funny thing, George, is when I remembered this yesterday, and I don't necessarily like to troll people on Twitter, but you could almost do a whole series of, I know he's on a different network than NBC, but Jimmy Kimmel's mean tweets and reading what people write. Obviously, there's a lot of negative feedback, again, and people that don't like something are far more likely to write in or tweet you or Facebook message you than if they liked it. So it was a few days prior to the December derecho, and I got this tweet that said, I assume that you're not going to be saying to get outside and enjoy the beautiful day that we're expecting in a few days, but you'll be sure talking about the world burning. Well, I don't know how many people enjoyed 80 to 90 mile per hour winds and 61 tornadoes. It doesn't sound like my kind of day to enjoy. But that made me laugh. And that's a tweet that a lot of the oh, you're terrible, you stink, those emails, okay, you grow a thick skin and you forget them. But that was an email, or that was a tweet that stuck with me. And that's one that I'll remember because it made me laugh. Yeah. Because in 3 days, it's not going to be sunny and 75. It's going to be a day that we always remember.
Yeah. And we'll never forget. Like I said, I had never even heard of derecho prior to the first one in the summertime, then this winter one. Well, I'm on point now, folks. I'm going to be looking for this. And so let's talk about weather patterns here because, I've heard you talk about climate on your show when it comes to drought. Now, well, we've got a drought here in this part of Iowa, and it seems like we have drought broken by periods of severe flooding, but it's these wild fluctuations up and down. Now, weather always changes, always has. Like I said, that's one of the attractions of this state to some people, but not these kind of swings that we're seeing. And I would suspect that that's going to continue.
There's no question. There's a research scientist, Dr. Jennifer Francis, who works at Woodwell Climate Research Center in Massachusetts, but they do global climate research there. And she has coined the phrase weather whiplash. And that really is the perfect term for that, to have these extremes where you might go through the course of an entire year and get average precipitation. And on paper, that looks great. But what happens if you get 6 or even 8 of that 40 inches that you get annually within 24 hours? Yeah. That's the problem. Yeah. And that leads to flash flooding. That leads to erosion of our river and stream beds. That causes agricultural products. When you have fertilizers, pesticides, those wash off into the fields and enter into the river. So there are water quality issues, there's infrastructure issues, there are gastrointestinal issues when you have these quick-hitting, short-duration floods. But that also means the ground doesn't get a chance to absorb that water. So really, it only was perhaps a half an inch, depending upon how much that soil can absorb and take in. The rest of it basically just goes to waste. And that's the problem. So people, I think, oftentimes say, well, how can you have droughts and floods? That's how. And then when you're 90 to 100 degrees the next week, all of that rain that you had, all of that soil moisture begins to evaporate. And there you go. And then you get these what are known as flash droughts, these short duration, high intensity droughts that can be devastating to farmers, for anyone in this industry that you rely on stable weather. Going back to your question, George, about why I do this and why I think it's important. My hometown on Eastern Long Island, I think the fishing industry is very similar to agriculture, right? It's weather dependent. These are men and women that work very hard. It's not easy work. And it's essentially the mercy of Mother Nature. That's how you work day to day. And that industry is largely shut down in my hometown. The lobster industry, a couple of states north in Maine, is now shifting into the Canadian Maritimes. You tell a fisherman, a bayman, that there's no such thing as climate change, and I assure you they'll have choice words.
Yeah, and it doesn't make any difference if they're a Republican or a Democrat.
No.
It's not a politics thing. Yeah,
it isn't. And a lot of those professions tend to be conservative leaning. That's the way it is. I just don't want to see happen here what happened in my town, what's happening up in Maine right now. We have a chance to act, and inaction is just mind-blowing to me, because what part of this economy is based on agriculture? The percentages are huge. Imagine if that was taken out of Iowa's economy. That's what I'm concerned about.
Yeah, there wouldn't be any economy. I mean, we have the insurance industry, but
right.
Just paying off the claims, they might no longer exist. Yeah. Okay, let me bring this up now. I want to because Chris's time is limited here. Obviously, let me see if I can get this on screen here, because this is what I was talking about. This IPCC report from the United Nations. Now, I know Chris follows this. Climate change, 5 things we've learned from the IPCC report. They've got, the final on this thing is coming out. Here's the first one. First and foremost, I would say, things are way worse than we thought. From the melting of the Greenland ice sheet to the destruction of coral reefs, climate-related impacts are hitting the world at the high end of what modelers once expected, and much more quickly than previously assessed by the IPCC. My God, that's just horrific, folks. Right now, as the new report makes clear, around 40% of the world's population is highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. But the burden is falling mainly on those who did the least to cause the problem. For Africa, around 30% of all the maize growing areas will go out of production. For beans, it's about 50% on the current emissions trajectory, said Patrick Verkooyen, CEO of the Global Center on Adaptation, which assists governments and the private sector in pushing for large-scale changes. So there are certain parts of the world, particularly in Africa, which will become uninhabitable. And time is running out, as the IPCC report clearly says, to stop the forces driving this new climate apartheid, he told the BBC News. Okay, so this goes kind of along with what you're talking about, Chris. They're talking about areas of the world being uninhabitable. Now, here in the heartland in Iowa, you may be able to inhabit it, but you may not be able to till it, and you certainly may not be able to till it as productively as you used to be able to.
You're absolutely right. These are impacts that I know people say Florida was supposed to be underwater in the 1990s. Again, a lot of that's the misinformation, disinformation campaign that grew legs and people are running with it. The fact is that is a true assessment that our models have been very conservative, and people need to understand that climate models versus our weather models are very, very different. Again, a lot of these climate models use ocean sediment that go back hundreds of thousands of years, ice cores that also go back hundreds of thousands of years. You have tree rings, which give us hundreds of years to thousands of years of data. Now, with that, we're able to tell how certain atmospheric elements react in the environment. carbon dioxide concentrations. No, we won't be able to tell you what's going to happen, what the high temperature will be on the 4th of July in 2075. But we do know these trends, and we do know the impacts, and all of that data is put into our climate models, which again have been underdoing the impacts of climate change. But yes, when it comes to the agricultural business here, that's just one of the many sectors in this country that could take a devastating hit by the impacts of climate change. Our coastal communities, George, for example, there are some that, again, with 1 foot of sea level rise, I did the calculation, I think there are about 77,000 properties that are within a foot of sea level, meaning with 1 foot of sea level rise in the next couple of decades, those homes won't just be flooded. That will be the new water level. Yeah. And managed retreat is going to be an option for some of these communities. And I think it's going to be an option for so many communities. Where do you come up with the money to bail everyone out that owns these properties? What happens to the banks that lend 30-year mortgages to these properties? What happens to that when the house isn't livable anymore?
Well, and what happens when it isn't insurable? That's the other part of it. I mean, then you have this forced, and I've never heard that term before. What you call that, managed retreat?
Managed retreat.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically an evac program. It reminds me, now I've got relatives in California. They've already fled. I mean, they've moved into the upper part of Michigan because of the heat. You just can't live there any longer. And of course, they're running out of water. And, you know, I started off talking, Chris, about the big three, climate, war, and healthcare, that I cover all the time on my podcast. The subtitle is News, Blues, and Interviews. But I also tell people it could be subtitled House of Mirrors, because that's kind of what we're living in. Here's a country, even here in Iowa, where this immigration issue is huge. We're building walls on the Mexican border to try to keep people out. Immigration is at the top of everybody's minds. Well, think managed retreat. Think about it not here just in this country, but think about it from other parts of the world. I talked about Africa and these other places. If they can't grow their maize and their corn, they got to move. They got to move or starve. Well, in this global economy, this mobile society that we live in, guess where they're going to go? They're going to go where the weather's better, where the climate's better, where the water is. If you've got it, if we've got it, folks, you're going to have some new neighbors. I mean, people ought to think about it just along those lines, if none other.
Absolutely. When you have, and for everyone watching this, I recommend a book, All Hell Breaking Loose. It's by Michael Clare. He's a peace and war professor in Massachusetts. And he basically looks at the consequences of climate change on global conflicts, future conflicts, how the Pentagon never stopped preparing for climate change. Even though, again, a lot of people thought during the years between 2016 and 2020, climate change took a back seat. They still prepared for it because they know the risk. They know everything that you just mentioned is something that they need to be concerned about.
Yeah, and the bigger point there is a lot of people think, well, good, the military's on it. No, they're not doing that for us. They're not doing that as a protection they're doing that for themselves. I mean, the good news is it means they believe and they understand the climate catastrophe. The bad news is you're going to have to look for somewhere else for the assistance and help that you need to survive this, because as someone from the Pentagon, the defense area, Colonel Larry Wilkerson just said, he looked at the advancer on this IPCC report, and Chris, I'm sure you can agree with these numbers. He said 1.5 degrees Celsius increase you don't want to live in. 2 degrees you can't live in. And according to that IPCC report that I just had up on screen, the coverage on that, we're currently on a trajectory for 3 or 4 degrees. My God, that's mind-boggling. He said, if we continue like we are now, I don't think anybody expects that we will. Surely, my God will do something to change this trajectory. But if we don't, if we just sit here on our hands, if we just fiddle while the world burns, that 3 to 4 degrees is coming. And he says we may not see 2 generations from now. He said, you know, the current generation, obviously, the next one, but the one after that, maybe not. And this guy was the chief of staff for Colin Powell. I mean, he's not an alarmist. He's not a left-wing, commune living hippie. This guy is from the military, a former member of the military-industrial complex, Colonel Larry Wilkerson.
Yes. And I don't want to not mention the inspiration in Iowa, and what we're doing truly is pretty amazing when it comes to, so not only do we have to adapt, we have to mitigate, and mitigate includes cutting down our carbon emissions. Why this doesn't get more attention than it already does is mind-blowing. But 80% of our electricity was produced through renewable forms, through wind, through solar. Yeah. And there really are no states that compare to the level of renewable energy that we produce. Mid-American's commitment to 100% renewable just in a couple of years, we should be celebrating that. And we should be used as a model of how other states should follow our lead. But it seems like that isn't talked about. And for most, it falls off the radar.
Well, there's that is the silver lining to a dark cloud, but the dark clouds are still there. Now, my lefty friends will say, yeah, Mid-American Energy is doing that, and they are committing to that, but they still have their coal-fired plants, and they're still probably using those coal generation stations to export energy and to use it in other places. You're right about the state of Iowa. There's another thing that's looming, and we got to let Chris go here, but and I'm starting to tell people about this. If this situation in Ukraine, which I started off mentioning, if it continues the way that it is, and Eastern Europe in particular, but all of Europe runs into this gas crisis because they can't get it from Russia, they're going to get it from us. And that means they're going to get it from these pipelines. They're going to get it from these CO polluting fracking pipelines, and we'll probably have to even create more of them, if you can think of that, and we need many fewer because of that situation that's going on in Ukraine. All this stuff is interrelated. Well, Chris, I have a tendency to digress into my lefty politics at times, but I want to give you a last word here talking about the climate and meteorology, and really anything that you want to talk about that's weather related.
Well, we may be at well, I don't even want to say it, but, globally, obviously times are scary. During World War II, we rallied. Our car industry changed and made munitions. They made tanks. They made aircrafts. They were able to retool the entire industrial sector of our economy here in the United States. So saying renewable energy is not attainable and it's impossible, that is a lie. Because we did it once before, we can do it again. It isn't taking away jobs, it's creating jobs, it's retooling jobs, it's retooling skill sets. Again, another professor that I interviewed while I was in Massachusetts, he's an economics professor, and his side job is to create plans for states to become completely renewable. And he has found the formula to retrain, retool, and then people that are nearing the end of their career, retirement plans that they can live comfortably. And we're not having to shell out tons of money, more than we already are. People need to also realize that if you watch football, the number of people that really are in coal right now can all fit inside Gillette Stadium in Foxborough, Massachusetts. These numbers are in most cases overblown and exaggerated. Again, but these are skill sets. These are people that can do amazing work in the sectors of renewable energy and green technology. And I want people to remember that. And I want people to really look at the information that's being put out there and use that lens and be critical of the information that is out there, because a lot of the misinformation and disinformation campaigns that are being used now were being used long before those cigarette labels had, smoking causes cancer. A lot of it's the same, and a lot of the strategy and the techniques are the same. So don't be fooled by what you see and what you hear. Something that's also pretty interesting, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a lot less of this messaging now that a certain nation has been excluded from the conversation on social media.
Oh, really?
there's a lot less pushback because it's something that other people have observed. I've observed it as somebody that's been very vocal on climate change. The pushback just never really quite made sense. And it's pretty telling. It's pretty telling that a lot of it is not, in fact, somebody truly behind a keyboard in this country. So.
Well, that's great. That's a great close. Folks, that's a KCCI meteorologist, Chris Gloninger. Now, he's not just a meteorologist. He's just not a weatherman. He's a truth teller, folks, I'm telling you, and he's making a difference. Chris, thanks again for coming on Podcast by George.
George, thanks for the invite.
Yeah, we'll check back in again because there's one thing about the weather. It's always in the news and it's always changing. So we'll be talking to Chris again soon, I hope. And folks, I hope you like Podcast by George. And if you do, my final closing remarks are always go to podcastbygeorge.com. Click on an icon there, a platform where you would like to subscribe and be notified of upcoming episodes with folks like Chris Gloninger. You'll get notified and you'll be able to watch them all. And we're everywhere, really, that podcasts are seen or heard, including Spotify and the iHeartRadio app and, YouTube, Facebook, obviously, but even Amazon, all kinds of places, Stitcher. Go there and pick a place that you want to be, and you'll be on the Podcast by George notification list. But that's going to do it for now. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.